boy returns from death with a shocking God message from heaven. I remember that day with crystal clarity, not just because it was the day I died, but because of everything that happened in those final moments before darkness claimed me. The morning sun painted golden streaks across Main Street as I helped Mrs. Thompson with her groceries. She was a familiar sight around our church, this tiny woman with silver hair and kind eyes that seemed to hold ancient wisdom. "You're a blessing, Ethan," she said, pressing a small wooden cross into my palm. "Keep it close. You never know when you might need God's protection." Something in her voice made me shiver, despite the warm spring air. And through the window of Harrison's pharmacy, I caught glimpses of my parents arguing again. Mom's face was flushed with anger, Dad's hands gesturing wildly as they fought. The divorce papers sat between them like a wall. I clutched the wooden cross tighter, whispering the prayer I'd repeated countless times: "Dear God, please don't let them split up. Please help them remember their love." That's when I heard the screech of tires. Time slowed to a crawl. I saw Pastor Michael's face through the windshield, horror dawning in his eyes as he slammed the brakes. I heard Mrs. Thompson cry out, "Ethan!" The groceries scattered across the pavement, oranges rolling like tiny suns, a gallon of milk exploding into a white river. I thought about how Mom and Dad had stopped speaking to each other at breakfast. I thought about how Pastor Michael had preached about God's plan just last Sunday. I thought about Mrs. Thompson's strange warning and the cross still warm in my hand. The impact, when it came, was both harder and softer than I expected. Mom's scream cut through the air like broken glass. Dad's voice bellowed my name. Pastor Michael's car door slammed, and Mrs. Thompson, she just stood there, a strange light in her eyes, watching as my world faded to black. I was 10 years old when I died on Main Street, outside Harrison's pharmacy on a beautiful spring morning. But death, as I would soon learn, wasn't the end of my story. It was just the beginning. And the message I brought back would change everything, not just for my family, but for our entire community and perhaps the world itself. If you found value in this story, please consider subscribing to join our community. Your support helps us continue sharing these profound messages of hope and transformation with others around the world. Life before the accident was a delicate balance of hope and heartbreak. Our house on Maple Street, with its white picket fence and red door, looked perfect from the outside. But inside, the tension between Mom and Dad had been growing like a storm cloud ready to burst. My father, James Wilson, worked as a corporate lawyer at the city's biggest firm. He was tall and imposing in his tailored suits, but I remembered when he used to wear jeans and play catch with me in the backyard. These days, he spent most of his time at the office, coming home late with his tie loosened and shoulders heavy with exhaustion. "It's for the family," he'd say, but Mom and I both knew he was hiding from the emptiness that had grown between them. Mom, Sarah Wilson, taught 4th grade at Lincoln Elementary. She had this way of lighting up a room with her smile, but lately that smile had become rare. I'd catch her crying in the kitchen when she thought no one was watching, quickly wiping away tears when I walked in. She'd started talking about fresh starts and new beginnings, words that terrified me because I knew what they really meant. I became an expert at reading the signs of an impending fight. The way Mom's jaw would tighten when Dad missed another dinner. How Dad's fingers would drum against the table when Mom mentioned her brother's divorce. I learned to intervene before the storm hit, asking for help with homework, mentioning a funny thing that happened at school, or sometimes just knocking over a glass of water to break the tension. Every Sunday we'd sit in church together, putting on our best faces for the congregation. Mom would sing in the choir, her voice rising clear and strong above the others. Dad would serve as an usher, greeting people with firm handshakes and warm smiles. We looked like the perfect family, but I could feel the fractures growing deeper each week. The divorce papers arrived on a Tuesday. I found them in Dad's briefcase while looking for a pencil sharpener. The words "petition for dissolution of marriage" felt like ice in my stomach. That night I prayed harder than I'd ever prayed before, kneeling beside my bed until my knees ached. "Please, God," I whispered into my clasped hands, "don't let them break apart. Help them remember why they fell in love. Show them it's not too late." I started leaving little notes around the house, old photos of happier times, drawings I'd made of our family, cards from anniversaries past. I'd place them where they'd find them: in Dad's briefcase, Mom's teaching binder, on the bathroom mirror. Sometimes I'd catch them looking at these reminders, a softness returning briefly to their faces before the walls went up again. At night I could hear them arguing in hushed voices, trying not to wake me. They fought about money, about time, about priorities, but mostly I think they fought because they'd forgotten how to talk to each other any other way. The silence between their arguments was even worse than the fighting. I became the bridge between them, carrying messages back and forth like a diplomat between warring nations. Tell your father dinner's at 6, let your mother know I'll be late. I hated being their messenger, but I hated the thought of them splitting up even more. The day before the accident, I overheard Mom talking to Aunt Jennifer about divorce lawyers. That night I didn't sleep. Instead, I sat by my window watching the stars and remembering how Dad used to point out constellations to me while Mom made hot chocolate. We were happy then. We were a family. Little did I know that it would take my death to bring them back together, but that's getting ahead of the story. Our church, First Baptist of Hope Valley, was more than just a building with a white steeple. It was the heart of our community. Pastor Michael Davidson had been leading our congregation for 15 years, his powerful sermons drawing people from 3 counties over. Before the accident, I never would have guessed how our lives would become so tragically intertwined. But every Wednesday and Saturday I helped at the church's soup kitchen. Pastor Michael's daughter, Rachel, would often work alongside me, her blonde hair tucked under a hairnet as we served meals to the homeless. She had her father's kind eyes and her mother's gentle spirit. You have a servant's heart, Ethan, she'd tell me, and coming from her, it felt like the highest compliment. My faith was simple back then, pure and uncomplicated. I believed in God's love with the unwavering certainty of a child. During Sunday school, I would sit cross-legged on the floor, absorbing every Bible story Mrs. Anderson shared. The tale of David and Goliath, Daniel in the lion's den, Jesus walking on water, they weren't just stories to me. They were proof that miracles could happen, that faith could move mountains. Pastor Michael took a special interest in my spiritual development. He'd often find me in the church library after services, poring over religious texts. "You're searching for something, aren't you, Ethan?" He'd ask, sitting beside me with his worn leather Bible. He taught me about Scripture, but more importantly, he taught me about compassion. The church youth group met every Friday night in the basement. We'd play games, sing worship songs, and discuss our faith. Rachel would bring her guitar, leading us in renditions of Amazing Grace and How Great Thou Art. Those evenings felt sacred, filled with possibility and purpose. I volunteered whenever I could, cleaning the sanctuary, helping with Vacation Bible School, visiting elderly church members. Mrs. Thompson, in particular, became a regular part of my routine. Every Saturday morning I'd help her with groceries or yard work. There was something different about her, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. She spoke about God as if she knew him personally, and her predictions had an unsettling way of coming true. "God has special plans for you, Ethan," she'd say, her eyes seeming to look straight through me. "He's preparing you for something important." I didn't understand what she meant then. How could I? The church calendar marked our lives: Easter sunrise services, summer picnics, Christmas pageants. I played the shepherd in that year's nativity play, standing guard over plastic sheep while Rachel, as Mary, cradled the baby Jesus. Pastor Michael's sermon that Christmas Eve was about how God often chooses the most unexpected people to carry out his will. Our community wasn't perfect. We had our share of gossip and disagreements, usually over things like the color of the new carpet or which songs to sing during worship. But beneath it all was a bedrock of faith and mutual support. When someone was sick, casseroles appeared on their doorstep. When someone lost their job, the church rallied together to help. Looking back now, I realize God was weaving a tapestry, connecting all of us in ways we couldn't see. Pastor Michael's guilt over the accident, Rachel's unwavering friendship, Mrs. Thompson's mysterious presence, every thread would prove essential to the greater purpose that was coming. The Sunday before the accident, Pastor Michael preached about sacrifice and redemption. Sometimes he said, his voice filling the sanctuary, God allows us to experience darkness so we can truly appreciate his light. I sat in the third pew between my arguing parents, not knowing how soon those words would take on new meaning. That same day, Mrs. Thompson stopped me after service. She pressed a small wooden cross into my hand and quoted Psalm 23, "Though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil." Her words sent a chill down my spine, but I tucked the cross into my pocket, not knowing it would be with me when everything changed. None of us could have predicted how our faith would be tested, how our community The impact felt like being hit by a wave, sudden, overwhelming, and strangely peaceful. I remember fragments: the screech of tires on asphalt, Pastor Michael's face contorted in horror, Mrs. Thompson's eerily calm expression, and my parents' voices cutting through the chaos. The wooden cross Mrs. Thompson had given me dug into my palm as I flew through the air. Time seemed to slow down, allowing me to notice the smallest details: how my mother's coffee cup shattered against Harrison's pharmacy window, how my father vaulted over the counter with impossible speed, how Pastor Michael's hands trembled on the steering wheel. Oh God, no. Not Ethan. Mom's scream would haunt the nightmares of everyone present that day. She reached me first, her hands hovering over my broken body, afraid to touch me. Dad was right behind her, his lawyer's composure shattered as he desperately searched for a pulse in my neck. Pastor Michael stumbled out of his car, his face ashen. I didn't see him. Dear Lord, I didn't see him. He fell to his knees beside me, his clerical collar suddenly seeming to choke him. Please God, not this child. Take me instead. The crowd gathered quickly, our small town's morbid curiosity drawing them like moths to a flame. Mrs. Thompson had vanished, though no one seemed to notice or remember her being there at all. The groceries she'd been carrying lay scattered across the pavement, oranges rolling into the gutter, milk spreading like a white river of tears. The ambulance arrived with wailing sirens, paramedics moving with practiced efficiency. No pulse, one called out, starting chest compressions. My parents clung to each other, their impending divorce forgotten in the face of possibly losing their only child. Dad held Mom as she sobbed into his chest, his own tears falling into her hair. James, Mom whimpered, using Dad's first name for the first time in months. We can't lose him. We can't lose our baby. We won't, Sarah, Dad promised, his voice cracking. God won't take him from us. He can't. Pastor Michael paced behind them, praying loudly, his words tumbling over each other in desperate supplication. Lord Jesus, spare this child. Let this cup pass from him. Take my life instead, Lord. This is my fault, my sin to bear. The paramedics worked tirelessly, their actions becoming increasingly urgent. Still no pulse, they reported. Charging defibrillator, the sound of the electric shock made Mom cry out again, but Dad held her tighter. Through it all, my parents never let go of each other. Months of anger and resentment melted away in the crucible of possible loss. I would later learn that Dad had thrown the divorce papers into a nearby trash can, where the spilled milk slowly turned them into pulp. Remember when he was born, Dad whispered to Mom. How tiny his hands were. How he grabbed my finger and wouldn't let go. Mom nodded against his chest. He's always been so strong, so full of life. Please God, let him be strong now. Pastor Michael had stopped pacing and stood with his head bowed, tears streaming down his face. The weight of guilt pressed visibly on his shoulders, aging him years and minutes. I was rushing to a church meeting, he confessed to no one in particular. A meeting about renovating the sanctuary. Dear God, what have I done? The paramedics continued their work, each passing moment an eternity for those watching. The crowd had grown larger, and whispered prayers filled the air like incense. Members of our church community arrived, drawn by news spreading through our small town's grapevine. Then finally a miracle, or what seemed like one at the time. We've got a pulse, the words sent a wave of relief through the crowd. Mom's knees buckled, and Dad caught her, holding her close as they both wept. But this wasn't the end of our family's trial, it was just the beginning. As they loaded me into the ambulance, my parents climbed in together, their hands clasped tightly. Pastor Michael watched the ambulance drive away, making the sign of the cross and whispering, Lord, let me bear the burden of this sin. None of them knew yet about the journey I was on, or the message I would bring back. They couldn't have known that this tragedy would become the catalyst for not just our family's healing, but for something much larger than ourselves. And somewhere in the chaos, a small wooden cross lay forgotten on the pavement, its significance not yet fully understood. While my physical body lay in the emergency room, surrounded by frantic doctors and my grieving parents, I experienced something that would forever change not just my life, but the lives of everyone around me. Of clinical death, 10:47 a.m., a doctor's voice echoed from somewhere far away, but I wasn't afraid. Instead, I felt an overwhelming sense of peace and warmth. The chaos of the emergency room faded, replaced by a profound stillness that seemed to embrace me. The first thing I noticed was light, not the harsh fluorescent glare of hospital lights, but a soft, golden radiance that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Then I heard singing, not church hymns or angel choirs like you might expect, but something deeper, more primal. It was like the very essence of love had been transformed into sound. Be not afraid the words weren't spoken so much as felt, resonating through my entire being. A presence approached, not a figure or a form, but pure love given consciousness. In that moment I understood what the Bible meant when it said, "Perfect love casts out fear." Verses I had learned in Sunday school suddenly took on new meaning. I am the way, the truth, and the life echoed through my consciousness. And I understood it wasn't just a statement, but a promise. The presence seemed to envelope me, showing me things I can barely describe with human words. I saw my parents in the waiting room, clinging to each other like shipwrecked survivors. Dad was praying, really praying for the first time in years. Mom was clutching his hand so tightly her knuckles had turned white. Their love for each other, buried under years of hurt and misunderstanding, blazed like a beacon. Pastor Michael was in the hospital chapel on his knees, begging for forgiveness. His guilt was a tangible thing threatening to crush him. But I saw something he couldn't, how this moment would transform him, how his pain would become purpose. The presence showed me more scenes from my life played out like a movie, but I wasn't just watching them, I was feeling every emotion, understanding every consequence. Little acts of kindness I'd forgotten about had created ripples affecting people I'd never met. Even my smallest choices had mattered more than I'd known. Why am I seeing this? I tried to ask, but communication here didn't work that way. Instead of an answer, I was shown more visions, darkness spreading across communities, families torn apart, hearts hardening against each other. But within that darkness, points of light flickered and grew, people choosing love over fear, forgiveness over anger, unity over division. Then I saw Mrs. Thompson as she truly was, and understanding flooded through me. She wasn't just a kindly old woman from church, she was something else entirely, someone sent to prepare me for this moment. The wooden cross she'd given me wasn't just a trinket, but a sign, a marker of something profound about to unfold. Your time has not yet come, the presence conveyed. You have a message to carry, a purpose to fulfill. Images flooded my consciousness, people gathering in unity, healing old wounds, choosing light over darkness. I saw how my experience would ripple out, touching lives far beyond our small town. Scripture verses flowed through my mind, for I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans to prosper you and not to harm you, plans to give you hope and a future. Jeremiah 29:11. Now I understood these weren't just comforting words, but a divine promise being fulfilled. The presence began to fade, but before it did, it showed me one final vision, a future possibility where love triumphed over hate, where communities healed, where faith restored what fear had destroyed. But it wasn't guaranteed. It would depend on choices, millions of small choices by ordinary people choosing light over darkness. Remember, the presence impressed upon me, not in words but in pure understanding. Perfect love casts out fear. This is the message you must carry. The light began to dim, the peace starting to recede. I felt myself being pulled back toward the pain and confusion of the physical world. But I wasn't afraid anymore. I had been given a purpose, a mission, a message that needed to be shared. The last thing I remember before returning to my body was a sense of overwhelming love, not just for my family or my community, but for all of humanity. I understood then what Jesus meant when he commanded us to love our neighbors as ourselves. It wasn't just a nice idea, it was the only way forward, the only path to healing our broken world. Time of resuscitation, 10:53 a.m., 6 minutes had passed in earthly time. But in those 6 minutes, everything had changed. The return to consciousness felt like swimming up through layers of thick honey. The first thing I became aware of was pain, deep, throbbing pain that seemed to touch every part of my body. The second was my mother's hand gripping mine, her wedding ring pressed against my palm where Mrs. Thompson's wooden cross had been. "He's waking up," Mom's voice trembled. "James, get the doctor." Opening my eyes was a struggle, but when I finally managed it, I saw both my parents leaning over me, their faces drawn with worry but united in a way I hadn't seen in months. Dad's arm was around Mom's shoulders, protective and sure. The doctors called my recovery miraculous. Multiple broken bones, internal injuries, a severe concussion by all medical standards I shouldn't have survived. But something inside me had changed, and healing seemed to flow through me like a river of light. Our church community rallied around us. Every day, the hospital room filled with visitors bringing flowers, cards, and covered dishes. Rachel came often, her guitar in hand, singing hymns softly by my bedside. But it was during one of these visits that the first vision struck. I was listening to Rachel sing Amazing Grace when the fluorescent lights began to flicker. The room seemed to darken at the edges, and suddenly I wasn't just seeing Rachel, I was seeing shadows gathering around her, around all of us. They weren't physical shadows, but something deeper, more insidious. They whispered of division, hatred, and fear. Ethan, Rachel's voice snapped me back. "You went pale. Should I get the nurse?" I shook my head, unable to explain what I'd seen. How could I tell her that beneath our community's unified surface I could now see darkness taking root? The same darkness I'd been warned about during my time. Away. Moan. The visions continued as I recovered. During physical therapy sessions, I'd see glimpses of the gathering storm, prejudices festering in hearts, old grievances growing like poison vines, fear building walls between neighbors. But I also saw points of light, small acts of kindness, moments of forgiveness, bridges of understanding being built. Pastor Michael visited daily, though at first he could barely look at me. The weight of guilt bent his shoulders, aged his face. But one afternoon, as he sat beside my bed reciting Psalms, I reached for his hand. "God forgives you," I said, the words coming from somewhere deeper than myself. "And so do I." He broke down then, sobbing like a child. Mom, who had been keeping a protective distance from him, moved to put a hand on his shoulder. It was the first crack in the wall of blame that had been building. The hospital staff began calling me their miracle boy, but they didn't know the half of it. While my body slowly knit itself back together, my spirit was being reformed into something new. Each night brought dreams filled with messages and warnings. Each day brought new understanding of the task ahead. Church members organized a prayer chain, keeping vigil around the clock. Mrs. Peterson from the choir brought homemade soup. Mr. Johnson, who I'd helped at the soup kitchen, came in his worn jacket to pray over me in his broken English. Even people who never attended church stopped by, drawn by something they couldn't explain. But Mrs. Thompson never came. When I asked about her, people looked confused. Who they'd say, or "Oh yes, the old lady with the groceries," but no one could quite remember her clearly. Their memories of her seemed to slip away like water through cupped hands. 6 weeks after the accident, I took my first steps without support. The physical therapist cried she'd never seen anyone recover so quickly from such severe injuries. But as I stood at the hospital window, looking out over our small town, I saw both light and shadow dancing through the streets. The real healing, the healing of our community's soul, hadn't even begun. That night I had another vision, stronger than before. I saw our town torn apart by hatred and fear. I saw families divided, friendships destroyed, faith twisted into a weapon. But I also saw hope, tiny sparks of light pushing back against the darkness. And I understood that my survival wasn't just a miracle, it was a mission. "You've been given a second chance," Dad said that evening, sitting beside my bed. He meant my life, but I knew it was more than that. We'd all been given a second chance: my parents' marriage, Pastor Michael's ministry, our entire community. The question was, what would we do with it? The revelation about Mrs. Thompson's true identity came during my third night in the hospital, in a moment that would change everything I understood about my experience. I was drifting between sleep and wakefulness, the pain medication making the world feel soft around the edges, when I saw her standing by my bed. "You recognize me now, don't you?" she asked, her form seeming to shimmer in the dim hospital light. She looked both like and unlike the elderly woman who had given me the wooden cross, her features the same, but somehow more radiant, more real. From the light I whispered, suddenly understanding, "You were there when I died." She smiled, and in that smile I saw echoes of the overwhelming love I'd experienced in that other place. "We've been watching your community for a long time," she said, "waiting for the right moment, the right vessel." The monitors beside my bed began to flicker, but not from any electrical disturbance. The very air seemed charged with something beyond physical understanding. "The cross you gave me," I said, "you knew what was going to happen." "We don't cause tragedy," she explained gently. "We prepare those who must face it. The darkness that's coming, It's been growing for generations, but so has the light that will fight it. She moved closer, and I could see now what I'd been too blind to notice before, how her feet didn't quite touch the ground, how the shadows seemed to retreat from her presence. Your death and return weren't an accident, Ethan. They were preparation. Then she shared the prophecy words that burned themselves into my mind with terrible clarity. She spoke of a time when darkness would seem triumphant, when communities would be torn apart by fear and hatred. But she also spoke of lights arising, not one great light, but many small ones joining together to push back the darkness. "Watch," she commanded softly, touching my forehead. Instantly, visions flooded my mind. I saw our town torn by conflict, families divided, faith twisted into a weapon. But I also saw hope, people choosing love over fear, unity over division, light over darkness. "Your role isn't to prevent the darkness," she explained. "It's to help others see it, understand it, and choose to stand against it. The greatest battles aren't fought with weapons, but with choices." The prophecy she shared wasn't like the dramatic predictions I'd learned about in Sunday school. It was more intimate, more immediate. It spoke of everyday decisions, small moments that would ripple out to affect everything. "The wooden cross," I remembered suddenly. "Where is it?" "Lost in the accident," she said. "But it served its purpose. It marked you as one who would see, who would understand, who would help others understand." She moved to the window, looking out over our sleeping town. "Others will doubt you," she warned. "They'll call you delusional, attention-seeking, even dangerous. The darkness will use their doubt as a weapon. But remember what you saw in the light. Remember the love that's stronger than any darkness." Before she vanished, she left me with one final warning. The hardest part isn't seeing the darkness, Ethan. It's helping others see it without letting it consume them. Show them not just the shadow, but the light that casts it out. Then she was gone, leaving behind only a faint scent of something I remembered from my death experience, a mixture of spring rain and summer sunlight. The monitors returned to their steady beeping, but everything had changed. I lay awake the rest of that night, watching shadows and light play across the hospital ceiling. The prophecy echoed in my mind, not just words, but a deep understanding of what was coming and what would be required of me, of all of us. When my parents arrived the next morning, they found me changed. The confusion and fear that had followed my return was gone, replaced by a clarity of purpose that must have shown on my face. "What is it, honey?" Mom asked, concerned by my intense expression. "I need to tell you something," I said. "About Mrs. Thompson, about what really happened when I died, and about what's coming." As I began to share the prophecy, I could already see it beginning to unfold, the light and shadow in my parents' faces as they struggled between doubt and belief, the first small ripples of what would become a wave of transformation in our community. The time of preparation was over. The real work was about to begin. The months following my release from the hospital were a blur of surgery dates and recovery periods. Each operation was meant to repair something. The accident had broken my shattered leg, my damaged shoulder, the persistent internal injuries that refused to heal completely. Through it all, Rachel Davidson became my constant companion, my anchor to normalcy in a world that had shifted on its axis. "You know what they're calling you at school," Rachel said one afternoon, perched on the edge of my hospital bed before my 4th surgery. "The boy who came back, like some sort of biblical superhero." She was trying to make me laugh, but we both knew the whispers weren't always kind. The hardest part wasn't the physical pain, it was watching how my experience affected others. Mom and Dad had reconciled, yes, but now they hovered over me constantly, terror flickering in their eyes whenever I winced or stumbled. Their love had become almost suffocating in its intensity. "I need to tell you something," I said to Rachel during one of her visits after my 5th surgery. My leg was propped up, still healing from the latest attempt to repair the damage. "Something happened when I was gone. Something I can't explain." Rachel set aside her guitar she'd been teaching me to play during my recovery and took my hand. Unlike others who dismissed my attempts to talk about my experience, she just listened. When I described the light, the presence, the warnings about darkness spreading, she didn't look afraid or skeptical. She looked thoughtful. "Is that why you keep watching people, like you're seeing something the rest of us can't?" she asked quietly. She was more perceptive than I'd realized. During my brief attempts to return to school between surgeries, I'd found myself overwhelmed by what I could see shadows of anger and fear clinging to people like dark cloaks, but also occasional bursts of light when someone showed kindness or love. The surgeries kept coming, each one promised to be the last, each one followed by another. There's still some internal bleeding we can't quite pinpoint, the doctors would say, or the bone isn't healing quite right. Through it all, Rachel would bring my homework, catch me up on school gossip, and most importantly, treat me like I was still me, not some miracle or prophet or curiosity. But school itself became increasingly difficult. Whispers followed me through the halls. Some kids avoided me completely, as if death might be contagious. Others wanted me to tell them about heaven, about God, about what it felt like to die. A few openly mocked me, calling me Jesus Jr. or the prophet of Hope Valley High. "Just ignore them," Rachel would say, glaring at anyone who dared make comments within her hearing. But it wasn't that simple. How could I ignore them when I could see the fear driving their cruelty, the darkness feeding on their insecurities? During my 7th surgery, this one to repair nerve damage in my arm, I had another vision. I saw Rachel, surrounded by her own struggles, carrying burdens I hadn't noticed because I'd been so focused on my own. Her father's guilt was crushing her mother's anxiety suffocating her, and the weight of being the good pastor's daughter was becoming too heavy to bear. When I woke up, I knew it was time to stop being just the recipient of her care and start being a true friend. "Tell me about you," I said the next time she visited. "Tell me everything." She broke down then, crying in that sterile hospital room, telling me about her father's nightmares, her mother's depression, the way some church members had stopped making eye contact with their family. "I'm supposed to be strong," she sobbed. "I'm supposed to be helping you." "Maybe we're supposed to help each other," I said, understanding flooding through me. This was part of it, part of the message, the mission. Healing couldn't happen in isolation. We needed each other. Between my 8th and 9th surgeries, Rachel and I started meeting in the hospital chapel. We'd pray together, but more importantly, we'd talk, really talk, about her fears, my visions, the changes we could both see happening in our community. She became not just my friend, but my confidante, the first person to truly understand that what had happened to me wasn't just about survival. "I think God saved you for a reason," she said one evening, as sunset painted the chapel windows in shades of gold and red. "Not just to live, but to help us see what we've become, what we could be." The doctors couldn't explain why I needed so many surgeries, why my body seemed to be holding on to the trauma of the accident, but I was beginning to understand. Each operation, each recovery period was giving me time to understand my purpose, time to build the relationships I would need for what was coming. Rachel's friendship became my lifeline during those endless months of hospitals and healing. While others treated me like a miracle or a mystery, she treated me like a person broken, healing, but still essentially me. She didn't need me to be a prophet or a saint. She just needed me to be her friend. And through our friendship, I began to see how God's plan was unfolding. The accidents, the surgeries, the long recoveries, they weren't just about physical healing. They were preparing us both for something bigger than ourselves. Something that would require not just faith, but understanding, compassion, and the kind of deep trust that only comes through shared struggles. As my 9th surgery approached, I held on to that understanding like a lifeline. The physical healing was important, yes, but the real transformation was happening in the quiet moments between operations, in whispered conversations and shared prayers, in the growing awareness that every struggle was part of a larger purpose. A purpose that was about to become clearer than any of us could have imagined. The visions became more frequent and intense during my recovery, no longer confined to moments of crisis or surgery. They would come without warning during lunch at school, in the middle of physical therapy, or while sitting in church, each one more vivid and urgent than the last. It was during one Sunday service, exactly 6 months after the accident, that I felt compelled to speak. Pastor Michael was delivering a sermon about faith in times of trial, his voice still carrying traces of guilt when his eyes met mine. The familiar darkness was there, swirling around the congregation, but something else was building too, a pressure, a certainty, a message that needed to be shared. I stood up, my newly healed leg shaking slightly. The entire congregation turned to stare. Mom reached for my hand, trying to pull me back down, but Dad stopped her. He must have seen something in my face, something that told him this was important. I need to tell you what I saw. My voice rang out stronger than I expected. When I died that day, I was shown something. Something we all need to hear. The church fell silent. Even the babies stopped crying. Pastor Michael stepped away from the pulpit, gesturing for me to take his place. Rachel, sitting in the choir loft, gave me an encouraging nod. I saw darkness coming. I continued, making my way to the front. Not physical darkness, but something worse: hatred, fear, division. I saw how it would spread through our community, our families, our churches. But I also saw light. I saw hope. And I saw how our choices, every single one of them, matter more than we know. As I spoke, the vision returned, stronger than ever. I could see the shadows clinging to people, but also the potential for light within each of them. Mrs. Johnson, who'd been spreading gossip about Pastor Michael's family, I could see her guilt, her loneliness, her need for connection. Mr. Thompson, who'd stopped attending church after a business dispute with another member, I saw his hurt pride, his sense of betrayal, but also his deep longing for reconciliation. "We're being tested," I said, my voice breaking with emotion. Not by God, but by our own hearts, by our ability to choose love over fear, unity over division, forgiveness over blame. I was shown what could happen if we let the darkness win: families torn apart, friendships destroyed, faith twisted into a weapon. But I was also shown what could happen if we choose the light. People were crying now. Pastor Michael had sunk into a pew, tears streaming down his face. Mom and Dad held each other, their recent reconciliation a living testament to what I was describing. The accident wasn't just about me, I continued. It wasn't just about Pastor Michael or my parents or any single person. It was about all of us, about what we could become, both the darkness and the light. We have a choice to make, all of us, every day, and these choices will determine everything. I described what I'd seen during my time between life and death: the overwhelming love, the understanding that every act of kindness or cruelty creates ripples we can't even imagine. I told them about the presence that had shown me these things, about the mission I'd been given. "But here's what you need to understand," I said, my voice growing stronger. "I wasn't shown these things because I'm special. I was shown them because we all need to see them. We all need to understand what's at stake." The vision was fully upon me now, and I could see it affecting others. People gasped as if they too could suddenly see the shadows and light I'd been describing. Rachel had moved to stand beside me, her presence steady and supporting. "Look at each other," I urged. "Really look. See past the arguments, the disagreements, the petty rivalries. See the light in each person. See the potential for love, for healing, for unity." As I spoke these words, something extraordinary happened. People began turning to their neighbors, really looking at each other, perhaps for the first time in years. Old grudges seemed to dissolve in the face of this new understanding. "This is just the beginning," I concluded, feeling drained but certain. What happened to me, my death, my return, it wasn't the miracle. The real miracle is what can happen next if we choose it. If we choose light over darkness, love over fear, unity over division. The silence that followed was profound. Then slowly people began to stand. First Pastor Michael, then my parents, then Rachel and her mother, then the entire congregation. They stood not in judgment, but in recognition, in understanding, in shared purpose. That Sunday marked the beginning of something new in our community. My public testimony wasn't just about sharing what I'd seen, it was about awakening others to what they could see too, if they only looked with their hearts instead of their eyes. But even as people gathered around me after the service, sharing tears and hugs and promises to do better, I could still see the darkness lurking at the edges of our congregation. This wasn't the end of our trial, it was just the beginning. And somewhere in the back of the church, I caught a glimpse of a familiar figure, Mrs. Thompson, watching with those ancient knowing eyes before disappearing once again. The real test was still to come. The crisis began 3 weeks after my testimony, starting as a small spark that quickly erupted into a devastating fire. It happened during a routine church board meeting, where the discussion about using the building fund to help struggling families instead of renovating the sanctuary turned into something ugly. Those people need to learn responsibility, not handouts. Mr. Harrison, the pharmacy owner, had said, his words carrying more darkness than he knew. We can't enable laziness in the name of charity. The argument spread beyond the church walls, dividing our community into factions. Some supported using the funds for renovation, claiming it would attract more members and ultimately help more people. Others insisted on immediate aid to families affected by the recent factory layoffs. But what had started as a reasonable debate about resource allocation transformed into something far more sinister. I saw it happening just as I'd been shown in my visions. The darkness feeding on pride, fear, and judgment. People who'd known each other for decades suddenly became strangers, their hearts hardening against former friends. The grocery store became a battleground of whispered accusations, the school parking lot a place where parents who'd once carpooled together now avoided eye contact. Then came the anonymous letters to the local newspaper, exposing personal secrets and past mistakes of people on both sides of the argument. Pastor Michael's past struggle with alcohol, long overcome, was dragged into the light. The financial troubles of families seeking aid were published for all to see, their dignity stripped away in black and white print. "This is what I was warned about," I told Rachel as we watched former friends cross the street to avoid each other. "The darkness doesn't just divide us, it makes us forget who we are." The crisis reached its peak when someone broke into the church late one night. They didn't steal anything, but they painted cruel messages on the walls, Bible verses taken out of context, twisted to wound rather than heal. The most painful part was recognizing the handwriting. It belonged to Mrs. Anderson, our Sunday school teacher of 20 years, whose family had been denied aid despite their struggles. The next Sunday, only half the congregation showed up. The other half had started meeting in the community center, led by Mr. Harrison, who claimed our church had lost its way. Families were split, with parents attending different services, children caught in the middle. I could see the darkness now more clearly than ever, not just surrounding people, but being actively fed by their choices, their words, their actions. Each harsh word, each refused handshake, each turned back added to its strength. But I could also see the light fighting back. Mrs. Johnson, despite losing her job at the factory, spent her evenings cooking meals for both groups. Mr. Thompson, who'd initially supported the renovation, quietly sold his prized classic car and anonymously donated the money to the Family Aid Fund. Rachel organized a youth group that deliberately included kids from both sides, bringing them together through service projects. The breaking point came during a town council meeting that had devolved into a shouting match. As accusations flew and tempers flared, I saw Mrs. Thompson again, standing at the back of the room. Our eyes met, and I understood what I had to do. I walked to the center of the room, my legs shaking but my voice steady. "Look at yourselves," I said, not shouting but somehow cutting through the noise. "Look at what we've become." The room fell silent as I described what I could see: the darkness feeding on their anger, their fear, their pride. But I also described the light that still lived in each of them, the potential for love and unity that no amount of darkness could extinguish. "Remember who we are," I pleaded. "Remember Mrs. Johnson bringing casseroles when your children were sick. Remember Mr. Harrison keeping accounts open during hard times. Remember Pastor Michael sitting with you in the hospital, Mr. Thompson helping you repair your roof, Mrs. Anderson teaching your children about God's love." As I spoke, something extraordinary happened. The darkness that I'd seen clouding the room began to recede, pushed back by memories of shared kindness, shared struggles, shared love. "The money isn't the real issue," I continued. "The real issue is whether we'll let this darkness win. Whether we'll forget who we are, who we've always been to each other." Pastor Michael stood then, tears in his eyes. "The church building fund," he said quietly, "was never about bricks and mortar. It was about building God's kingdom. And God's kingdom isn't a building its people. It's community. It's love." Mr. Harrison stood next, his face working with emotion. "I was wrong," he said simply. "I forgot what it means to be a community." One by one, people began to stand, to move toward each other, to bridge the divides that had grown between them. The darkness fought back, whispering of pride and righteousness, but the light was stronger. By the end of that meeting, plans were being made not just for how to use the building fund, but for how to heal our community. The crisis wasn't over, but something had shifted. People had seen what I could see, both the darkness and the light, and they had made their choice. As the meeting broke up, I looked for Mrs. Thompson, but she had vanished again. Yet her presence had served its purpose. The real miracle hadn't been my survival or my visions, it had been this moment, watching people choose light over darkness, love over fear, unity over division. But even as hope bloomed, I felt a warning in my heart. This had only been the first test. The real challenge was still to come. Pastor Michael's redemption began in the aftermath of the community crisis, though none of us realized it at first. He had been quietly carrying his guilt about my accident like a cross, letting it poison his ministry and his family life. But the night after the town council meeting, something changed. I found him alone in the church sanctuary, kneeling at the altar. "I've been praying for forgiveness for months," he said without turning around, somehow knowing it was me. "But I've been praying for the wrong thing." The sanctuary was dark, except for the eternal flame by the altar, but I could see both the shadows and light warring within him. "What do you mean?" I asked, though I already knew. "I've been asking God to forgive me for the accident," he said, his voice breaking, "when I should have been asking for the strength to forgive myself, to use what happened for his purpose, not wallow in my guilt." That Sunday, Pastor Michael delivered a sermon unlike any other. Standing before the newly reunited congregation, he laid bare his soul. He spoke about the accident, about his guilt, about how he'd let it corrupt his relationship with God and his community. "I thought I was being humble," he confessed, "carrying this guilt, but it was pride. Pride that made me think my guilt was more important than God's forgiveness. Pride that made me think my pain was more important than Ethan's message." The congregation sat in stunned silence as their pastor wept openly before them. Rachel, sitting beside me, gripped my hand tight enough to hurt. Her father's words were breaking something open in all of us. "God didn't save Ethan just to torture me with guilt," he continued. "He saved him to show us something. Something I've been too blind to see because I've been so focused on my own pain." He described how he'd watched our community tear itself apart, too paralyzed by his own guilt to provide the leadership we needed. How he'd seen families divided, friendships destroyed, faith perverted, and had done nothing because he felt he'd lost the right to speak. "But God doesn't call the qualified," he said, his voice growing stronger. "He qualifies the called. And I'm done letting my guilt silence what he's calling us to do." Then he did something unprecedented. He stepped down from the pulpit and asked everyone to gather in a circle, holding hands. The church was packed, both regular members and those who'd been meeting at the community center, drawn by word of mouth that something extraordinary was happening. "We're going to pray," he announced, but not like we usually do. "We're going to pray for vision to see what Ethan sees, to understand what he understands, to feel what he feels." For the next hour, people prayed, not polite, formal prayers, but raw, honest supplications. They prayed for forgiveness, not just from God, but from each other. They prayed for healing, not just of bodies, but of relationships, of hearts, of our community. As they prayed, I saw it happening, the light growing stronger, pushing back the darkness. Pastor Michael's voice rose above the others, no longer weighted by guilt, but lifted by purpose. The word spread quickly through our small town. People began arriving at the church, first a few, then dozens, then hundreds. Those who couldn't fit inside stood in the parking lot, forming their own prayer circles. Former enemies held hands, tears streaming down their faces as they asked for forgiveness and offered it in return. Mrs. Anderson, who had vandalized the church in her pain, stood supported by the very people she had attacked. Mr. Harrison worked his way through the crowd, personally apologizing to each family he had judged. The light grew stronger with each reconciliation, each embrace, each healing word. Pastor Michael moved through the gathering like a man transformed, no longer bent by guilt but standing tall in his restored purpose. He prayed with people, offered counsel, facilitated reconciliations. The darkness that had surrounded him for so long was being burned away by the light of service and love. The prayer gathering lasted well into the night. People brought food, set up lights, created a makeshift community kitchen in the church basement. Children fell asleep on blankets while their parents continued to pray and reconcile. It felt like a modern-day revival, but focused not on emotional displays but on genuine healing and restoration. As midnight approached, Pastor Michael called for silence. Standing in the center of the gathering, he made a declaration: from this day forward, this church, this community will be a place of healing, not judgment, of unity, not division, of light, not darkness. The response was immediate and powerful, a spontaneous chorus of amens that seemed to shake the very foundations of the building. In that moment I saw Pastor Michael as God saw him, not as the man who had accidentally struck me with his car, but as a vessel of healing and reconciliation. But even as we celebrated this powerful moment of redemption, I caught sight of Mrs. Thompson standing at the edge of the gathering. Her expression was both pleased and concerned, and I understood why. This beautiful moment of healing and unity was not the end of our journey, it was preparation for what was to come. Pastor Michael's redemption and the massive prayer gathering had shown our community what was possible when we chose light over darkness, but they had also made us a target. The darkness would not accept this defeat easily. As the gathering finally began to disperse in the early hours of the morning, I felt both hope and trepidation. We had witnessed something powerful, but the real test still lay ahead. And this time it would take more than prayers and tears to overcome it. The darkness was regrouping, gathering its strength, and soon it would strike back with a force that none of us, not even I, could have anticipated. The backlash began subtly. At first, anonymous comments on the local newspaper's website calling me a religious fanatic and attention-seeking teenager, but it quickly escalated into something far more sinister. Someone created a social media page dedicated to mocking our cult of light, posting edited videos of my testimony and Pastor Michael's redemption sermon. The threats started arriving at our house first as letters, then as late-night phone calls. "Stop spreading your lies," they'd say, "or not everyone can be saved." Mom wanted to call the police, but Dad, ever the lawyer, knew we had no real evidence of who was behind it. "It's exactly what I was warned about," I told Rachel one afternoon as we sat in her family's kitchen. "The darkness doesn't just attack directly, it uses doubt, fear, and ridicule to break people's spirit." But even I wasn't prepared for what happened next. Someone broke into my locker at school, stealing the journal where I'd been recording my visions. The next day, pages appeared all over the school, my private thoughts and fears displayed for everyone to mock. The darkness that had been circling our community had found its weapon, my own words, twisted and taken out of context. Rachel stood by me fiercely, confronting anyone who dared to laugh or whisper. "You don't understand what you're doing," she'd tell them, her voice trembling with anger and hurt. "You're letting darkness win." The ridicule spread beyond the school. Local businesses that had supported our prayer gathering began receiving threats of boycotts. Pastor Michael's car was vandalized, his tires slashed, the word "faker" was spray painted across our church doors. Then came the television crews, not just local news, but national networks drawn by the controversy. They portrayed our community as a battleground between religious extremism and reason. Every interview was edited to make us look delusional, every statement twisted to feed the growing narrative that we were a cult. Rachel was the one who kept me grounded through it all. "They didn't see what we saw," she'd remind me. "They didn't feel what we felt during the prayer gathering. They can't understand yet." But the darkness wasn't finished with us. On a rainy Tuesday evening, as Rachel was driving home from choir practice, someone ran her off the road. Her car flipped 3 times before landing in a ditch. I felt it happen before the phone call. Came a sudden searing pain in my chest and a vision of headlights bearing down with deliberate malice. By the time I reached the hospital, Rachel was in surgery, and the darkness around the building was thicker than I'd ever seen it. Pastor Michael sat in the waiting room, his face ashen. "They were targeting me," he whispered. "They went after her to punish me." The guilt that he'd so recently shed was threatening to overwhelm him again. The hours of waiting were excruciating. Our entire church community gathered in the hospital chapel, praying with an intensity that pushed back against the encroaching shadows. But this time the light seemed dimmer, struggling against a darkness that had grown bold and confident. When the doctor finally emerged, his face was grave. "She's stable," he said, "but there's swelling in her brain. We won't know the full extent of the damage until she wakes up." "If she wakes up," the darkness seemed to whisper. "This is what happens when you challenge us. This is the price of your light." I stood by Rachel's bedside that night, watching the monitors blink and listening to the steady rhythm of the ventilator. The girl who had stood by me through everything, who had believed in me when others doubted, who had helped me understand my own visions, now lay broken because of our shared mission. The darkness pressed in, whispering doubts and fears. Was this my fault? Had my testimony, my insistence on sharing what I'd seen, led to this moment? Would it have been better to keep silent, to let the darkness work quietly rather than provoke it into such violent resistance? Mrs. Thompson appeared in the doorway the first time I'd seen her clearly since the prayer gathering. "Now you understand," she said softly, "this is why you were chosen. Not because you're strong enough to fight the darkness, but because you're strong enough to bear the cost of fighting it." She disappeared before I could respond, leaving me alone with Rachel's unconscious form and the weight of a choice I never wanted to make. The darkness had struck a devastating blow, and for the first time since my death in return, I found myself questioning everything I'd been shown, everything I'd been called to do. The light within me flickered, threatened by a wave of doubt and fear that felt impossible to resist. 3 days after Rachel's accident, I stopped praying. The chapel that had once felt like a sanctuary now seemed empty, my words echoing hollowly against walls that held no answers. Rachel remained unconscious, and the darkness that had caused her accident continued to grow stronger, feeding on my doubts and fears. "I can't do this anymore," I confessed to my parents one evening, my voice breaking. "Everything I've done, everything I've said, it's only made things worse. Rachel's paying the price for my visions." Mom and Dad exchanged worried glances. Since their reconciliation, they'd been united in supporting my mission, but now I could see doubt creeping into their eyes, too. The darkness was working its way into our home, poisoning even their renewed faith in each other. I stopped going to church, couldn't bear to face Pastor Michael and his wife, to see their pain and know I was the cause of it. The journal pages that had been stolen and mocked at school now seemed like evidence of my delusion. Had I imagined everything? Had my near-death experience been just a dream, my visions nothing more than the product of trauma? The darkness pressed in, offering seductive whispers of normalcy. "Just stop," it seemed to say. "Go back to being a regular teenager. Forget what you saw. Forget what you were called to do. Look how much easier everything would be." One night I gathered everything connected to my experience, the remains of my journal, the newspaper clippings about the prayer gathering, even the small wooden cross Mrs. Thompson had given me before the accident. I took them to the backyard, lighter fluid in hand, ready to burn it all and try to return to a life without visions, without purpose, without this crushing weight of responsibility. As I stood there, hands shaking over the pile, memories flooded back, not just of the light I'd seen during my death, but of all that had followed. The healing of my parents' marriage, Pastor Michael's redemption, the prayer gathering that had united our community, Rachel's unwavering faith in me even when I doubted myself. "It's easier to walk away," a voice said behind me. It was Mrs. Thompson, appearing as she always did at crucial moments. "That's why so few answer when they're called. The cost feels too high." "Rachel might die because of me," I said, my voice raw with unshed tears. "No," she corrected gently. "Rachel might die because darkness fights back when light threatens it. That's not your fault. It's why your mission is so important." I sank to my knees in the damp grass, the lighter fluid slipping from my fingers. "I'm not strong enough." "No one is," she said. "That's why you're not meant to do it alone." She knelt beside me, her presence somehow pushing back the darkness that had been suffocating me. "You were shown what could happen if darkness wins. Is that the world you want Rachel to wake up to?" The question hit me like a physical blow. In my pain and fear, I'd been ready to surrender to the very darkness that had hurt her. I'd nearly betrayed everything she had fought alongside me to protect. The mission was never about being strong enough, Mrs. Thompson continued. It was about being faithful enough, about getting up every time darkness knocks you down, about choosing light even when everything seems dark. She reached out and touched the pile of memories I'd been ready to burn. "These aren't just records of your journey, they're weapons against darkness. Your story, your testimony, your unwavering faith despite doubts, these give others hope. Hope is what darkness fears most." As she spoke, I felt something shift inside me. The crushing weight of responsibility lifted, replaced by a different kind of understanding. I didn't have to be perfect or unafraid. I just had to keep choosing light, keep standing up, keep believing in what I'd been shown. Mrs. Thompson stood, her form seeming to shimmer in the moonlight. "Rachel needs you now more than ever. Not to be strong, but to be faithful. To keep believing in the light, even in this darkest hour." She vanished then, leaving me alone in the yard with my pile of memories and a renewed sense of purpose. The darkness hadn't lifted. If anything, it felt heavier around me. But now I understood its very intensity was a sign of its fear. Light was winning, even if it didn't feel like it. I gathered up the items I'd nearly destroyed and carried them back inside. The time for doubt was over. Rachel had never given up on me. I wouldn't give up on her or on the mission we shared. The darkness had struck hard, but it had made a crucial mistake. In trying to break my faith, it had only reminded me why that faith was so important. The morning after my backyard crisis of faith, I returned to the hospital with a new sense of purpose. The darkness still pressed heavily against the windows, but this time I didn't let it intimidate me. I sat beside Rachel's bed, took her hand, and began to talk. "Remember the first time I tried to tell you about my visions?" I said softly. "You didn't laugh or doubt, you just listened. Now it's my turn to be there for you." As I spoke, something extraordinary began to happen. People started arriving first, just a few, then dozens. Word had spread through our community that I had returned to Rachel's bedside, and they came to join me. Not just church members, but people from all walks of life. The mechanic who'd lost his job, the teacher who'd been mocked for supporting us, even some of the teenagers who had spread my journal pages around school. We didn't understand, one of them said, tears in her eyes. But we do now. The darkness, we can feel it, and we want to fight it. They formed a circle around Rachel's bed, joining hands. Pastor Michael arrived, his face lined with exhaustion but his eyes clear. He didn't speak, just took his place in the circle. The light I'd thought was dimming began to grow stronger. Mrs. Thompson appeared in the doorway, nodding in approval. This time others saw her too. They gasped as she stepped into the circle, her presence amplifying the growing light. "Perfect love casts out fear," she said, her voice carrying an authority that made the medical equipment tremble. "And perfect unity casts out darkness." The prayer that followed wasn't like anything I'd ever experienced. It wasn't just words or emotions, it was pure light, flowing through each person, connecting us all. The darkness that had seemed so overwhelming began to retreat. Hospital staff stopped in the doorway, drawn by something they couldn't explain. Some joined our circle. Others stood witness to something that defied medical understanding. The monitors tracking Rachel's brain activity began to show increasing signs of response. As our prayer reached its peak, the room filled with a light so bright it seemed to penetrate every shadow, every doubt, every fear. The darkness that had caused Rachel's accident, that had tried to silence our message, that had nearly broken my faith, it couldn't stand against the united light of our community. Rachel's eyes fluttered open. The doctor later called it a medical miracle. The swelling in her brain had subsided dramatically, leaving no lasting damage, but those of us who were there knew it was more than medicine. We had witnessed the power of united light against darkness. Mrs. Thompson approached Rachel's bed after the doctors had finished their examinations. "You see now," she said to all of us, "why darkness fights so hard against unity. Together, your light is unstoppable." The healing that happened that day went far beyond Rachel's recovery. The teenagers who had mocked me found their own faith awakened. The community members who had doubted began to understand. Even the hospital staff who witnessed it were transformed. As Rachel grew stronger, so did our community's resolve. The darkness had tried to break us by striking at our heart, but instead, it had only revealed how strong that heart was when we stood together. "I saw you," Rachel told me when we were finally alone. "When I was unconscious, I saw what you see. The light, the darkness, all of it. We all need to see it, Ethan. That's why you were chosen." Mrs. Thompson's last words before she disappeared that day stayed with me. Divine intervention rarely looks the way people expect. Sometimes it's not about parting seas or stopping suns. Sometimes it's about bringing people together in perfect unity against the darkness. The light that had awakened in our community that day wouldn't fade. The darkness had meant to destroy us through Rachel's accident, but instead it had only made our purpose clearer, our unity stronger, our light brighter. But even as we celebrated Rachel's recovery, I knew this victory was just the beginning. The final battle was still to come. The revelation came 3 days after Rachel's recovery, during another quiet evening in the hospital. I was helping Rachel take her first tentative steps around the room when Mrs. Thompson appeared in the doorway, but this time she was different. A soft light emanated from her, not the harsh fluorescent glare of the hospital lights, but something pure and familiar, the same light I'd seen during my own death experience. "It's time you knew the truth," she said, her voice carrying that same otherworldly resonance I remembered. Rachel gripped my arm tighter, but she wasn't afraid. Like me, she recognized something she'd seen before. "You're not just Mrs. Thompson, are you?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. The wooden cross she'd given me before my accident seemed to warm in my pocket. She smiled, and in that smile I saw ages pass. "I am a messenger," she said simply, "sent to prepare you, to guide you, to help you understand your purpose. The darkness you've been fighting, it's older than time, and the light that fights it is just as ancient." Rachel sank into a nearby chair, her eyes wide with wonder. "You were there," she whispered. "When I was unconscious, you showed me what Ethan sees." Mrs. Thompson, or whatever she truly was, nodded. "Just as I showed Ethan during his time between life and death. The visions, the understanding, the ability to see both light and darkness, these weren't random gifts. They were preparation." She approached us, and the air seemed to shimmer around her. "The prophecy is being fulfilled, but not in the way many expected. This isn't about grand gestures or supernatural displays. It's about human hearts choosing light over darkness, love over fear, unity over division." "The accident," I said slowly, understanding dawning. "My death and return, Rachel's accident and recovery, they weren't just events, they were signs," she confirmed, "showing both the darkness's power and its limitations, showing how light grows stronger when people unite against the darkness. Each test has prepared your community for what's coming." She turned to Rachel. "Your recovery wasn't just a miracle, it was a demonstration of the power of united light. The darkness thought striking you would break Ethan's faith, shatter your community's unity. Instead, it brought you all together more strongly than ever." "But why us?" Rachel asked. "Why our small town?" Mrs. Thompson's smile held both wisdom and sadness. "Great changes often begin in small places. Your community's story will spread, inspiring others to recognize and resist the darkness in their own communities. Like ripples in a pond, the light will spread." She reached out, touching both our foreheads gently. In that moment I saw everything clearly, how each event, each challenge, each victory had been part of a larger plan. How our small town's struggle between light and darkness was a microcosm of a much larger battle. "The final test is coming," she said, her form beginning to fade. "Everything that's happened has prepared you for it. Remember, the darkness is strongest just before it breaks. When it seems most hopeless, that's when your light must shine brightest." Before she vanished completely, she left us with one last message. The prophecy speaks not of one person bringing light, but of many lights joining together to push back the darkness. That's why you were chosen, Ethan, not to be the light, but to help others find their own light. Then she was gone, leaving only a lingering warmth and the scent of something like spring rain. Rachel and I looked at each other, understanding flooding between us. All the pieces were falling into place: my death and return, her accident and recovery, our community's struggles and unity. "But we're ready," Rachel said softly, standing straighter despite her lingering weakness. And looking at her, seeing the light that shone in her eyes and feeling it resonate with my own, I knew she was right. Whatever the final test would be, we would face it together. The prophecy was being fulfilled, not through supernatural power, but through the simple, profound choice to stand together against the darkness. The final test came in a way none of us expected, not as a dramatic battle between light and darkness, but as a quiet revolution of hearts and minds that spread far beyond our small town. It began with Rachel's discharge from the hospital, when reporters arrived to cover what they thought was just another miraculous recovery story. But this time we were ready. Instead of hiding from the cameras or letting them twist our story, our entire community came forward to speak. Not just about the miracles and visions, but about the deeper transformation that had taken place among us. "Look at these people," Pastor Michael told the reporters, gesturing to the gathered crowd outside the hospital. "A month ago we were divided. Now look at us." The cameras panned across faces that told their own stories: former enemies standing together, broken relationships mended, old wounds healed. My parents stepped forward, hand in hand. "Our son's experience didn't just save our marriage," Mom said, her voice steady. "It showed us what real love looks like, not just between two people, but throughout an entire community." Dad, never one for public speaking, surprised everyone by adding, "We thought we were losing our family. Instead, we found a bigger one." He gestured to the crowd, where dozens of families stood together, their own stories of healing and reconciliation written on their faces. The transformation went beyond just emotional healing. The church building fund that had once divided us became a catalyst for change. Working together, we established a community center that served both physical and spiritual needs. The former battleground became a symbol of unity. Mr. Harrison, who had once opposed helping struggling families, now ran a job training program at his pharmacy. Mrs. Anderson, who had vandalized the church in her pain, led support groups for families facing similar struggles. Every person who had been touched by darkness became a bearer of light. The media couldn't quite understand what they were seeing. They came looking for a sensational story about miracles and visions, but found something more profound: a community that had faced its darkest shadows and emerged stronger, more united, more alive with purpose. Rachel, still weak but growing stronger each day, became a symbol of this transformation. "We all have the choice," she told a reporter who asked about her recovery. "We can let darkness break us, or we can let it show us how strong our light can be when we stand together." The change was most visible in the small things: the way people greeted each other on the street, the spontaneous prayer circles that formed when someone was in need, the quiet acts of kindness that had become our new normal. The darkness hadn't disappeared, but it no longer held the power to divide us. My own family's healing deepened in ways I hadn't thought possible. Mom and Dad didn't just stay together, they rediscovered the love that had first brought them together. Our home became a gathering place for others seeking healing and hope. "Remember when we thought we were losing everything?" Mom asked one evening as we watched yet another family leave our house with renewed hope. "We had no idea we were about to gain so much more." The transformation spread beyond our town's borders. People came from neighboring communities, drawn by the stories they'd heard. They arrived skeptical but left changed, carrying seeds of light back to their own communities. Through it all, I kept seeing what I'd been shown during my death experience: the potential for light within every person, the power of choice, the strength of united hearts standing against darkness. But now I wasn't seeing it alone. Others had begun to develop their own awareness, their own ability to recognize and resist the darkness while nurturing the light. The prophecy Mrs. Thompson had spoken of was fulfilling itself not through supernatural displays, but through the daily choices of ordinary people choosing light over darkness, unity over division, love over fear. Our small town's transformation became a beacon, a living testament to the power of united light against even the deepest darkness. But the story wasn't over yet. The final chapter was still to come. The final message came not in a dramatic vision or miraculous event, but on a quiet Sunday morning 1 year after my accident. Our church was packed not just with locals, but with visitors from across the country who had heard our story. Rachel sat beside me, fully recovered, her hand in mine as Pastor Michael stepped up to the pulpit. "A year ago," he began, "we witnessed what seemed like a tragedy. A young boy died on our streets, a pastor lost his way, and a community stood on the brink of division. But God had a bigger plan." As he spoke, I could still see the light in darkness, but now it was different. The darkness no longer threatened. Instead, it served as a contrast that made the light shine brighter. Looking around the sanctuary, I saw others who could see it too, their faces glowing with understanding. The message was never about one person's vision, I stood to say, feeling called to share one last truth. It was about all of us. Every single person has both light and darkness within them. The choice, the real miracle, is what we do with that knowledge. Rachel stood beside me, her voice joining mine. "We learned that light isn't about being perfect. It's about being together, about choosing love when hate would be easier, about reaching out when you want to pull away." One by one, members of our community stood to share their parts of the story. Mr. Harrison spoke about learning humility. Mrs. Anderson shared about finding forgiveness. My parents testified about rediscovering love. Each story added to a greater truth, a final message that seemed to fill the sanctuary with golden light. The battle between light and darkness isn't some far-off apocalyptic event, I concluded. It's happening right now in every heart, in every choice we make. And we don't fight it with weapons or power, but with love, unity, and the daily choice to stand together. As if to confirm these words, Mrs. Thompson appeared one last time, standing in the back of the church. But now everyone could see her as she truly was a messenger of light, sent to guide us through our darkest times. Her smile held both approval and challenge. "The story doesn't end here," she said, her voice carrying to every heart. "Each of you will face your own battles, your own choices between light and darkness. But now you know you're never alone in that fight." The light that filled the sanctuary that morning wasn't just spiritual, it was the light of understanding, of purpose, of united hearts standing against darkness. It was the light I'd seen during my death experience, now visible to all who chose to see it. As Mrs. Thompson faded from view one final time, her last words echoed in our hearts. "Remember, the greatest light often comes from the deepest darkness. Your story will give others hope. Share it well." And that's why I'm sharing it now with you. Not just my story, but our story, a story of death and return, of darkness and light, of division and unity. A story that continues in every heart that chooses light over darkness, love over fear, unity over division. The accident that seemed like an ending became a beginning. The darkness that tried to divide us only made us stronger. And the message that began with one boy's vision became a testament to the power of united hearts standing against darkness. As I look around our town today, I still see both light and darkness. But now I see something else, two people who understand their power to choose, to stand together, to push back the darkness with united light. The real miracle wasn't my return from death or Rachel's recovery, it was the transformation of ordinary people into bearers of extraordinary light. The choice remains for me, for my community, and for you. Light or darkness, love or fear, unity or division. The power lies not in the choosing itself, but in choosing together, standing together, shining together. For in the end, that's how light wins. Not alone, but together, always together. Thank you for sharing this journey with me. If our story of love, loss, and redemption has touched your heart, please take a moment to subscribe to this channel and support our team's mission to share stories of hope and healing. Your comments and thoughts mean the world to us. What moments resonated with you? Have you experienced similar struggles with faith and loss? Share your story below. Don't forget to like this video and share it with friends and family who might need a reminder that love transcends death and that healing is always possible. Together we can spread hope and light to those who need it most.